Welcome to the May 2025, May 13th, 2025 Embedded Special Interest Group meeting. And today we have two agenda items on our agenda for discussion. And we also wanted to say hello to folks who are joining the call who are new. If you're watching this in the recording and would like to join, the details are up on the Embedded SIG website. And we will put a link to that in the description below. And you are more than welcome to come along. Just as a reminder, you don't need to be a member of the Bytecode Alliance or the W3C to join these calls. In fact, you're invited to come along and do so regardless and see what we're talking about. Today's agenda items have two things to talk about. One is a discussion that's been going on about adding or changing the WASI SDK to by default support Lime 1. And the second discussion item is more of a brainstorming about action items you need to undertake to get the LTS up and running and put a bit of effort into that. Those are the two items that are on the agenda already today. Before we get into those, is there anything else anybody would like to talk about while we're together today? And we'll make sure we carve out a bit of time for that. Going once, going twice. Okay, so what I'm going to do really briefly is just we're going to go to our meeting notes and the agenda. I will share that on our screen and just go through some of it with you, what's happening, go through the discussion on line 1 and open it up to everybody, get an opinion on it, and then take it from there. Okay, so share. Not used to this setup. I think this is the one we want. Okay, so you should see browse window, the lead note. So what's going on is this is a discussion by Dan Goldman about supporting Lime 1, which is it's basically a set of WebAssembly proposals that are kind of bundled up into an interim almost standard. And Dan had a discussion with the Wasentime team about turning that on. In parallel, there's a discussion with Yamamoto about also enabling it for WAMR. And in the discussion notes, Lime includes these extensions here, mutable globals, multi-value, and so on, but also this extended const work. And it looks like that the extended const would require, when we go digging through some issues, Yamamoto points this out in a WAMR discussion, that it's not trivial to implement for WAMR, and it could require, or looks likely to require, some retooling of the ahead of time work in order to enable it. And then does it make sense to have this turned on by default in the WASI SDK? So in the online discussions, it kind of goes on, and Yamamoto points out to Dan, this could be an issue. And part of that, Dan suggests, we're trying to create a common baseline, but don't want to fall too far behind, got to add stuff. And Dan points out developers who want to target all the specs should be asked to rebuild the libc themselves, right? So that falls into what we've been discussing for the long-term support. Is that something that we want to do and basically fork the WASI SDK and provide one that works specifically with the current version of WAMR and keep those in lockstep? It's probably something we want to do as part of LTS anyway. This point's just sort of helping to drive that home. Is it something we want to do, want to discuss? Are there any other implications of enabling the Lime 1 set of WebAssembly, core WebAssembly proposals in the libc build for WASI SDK? Is there anything else we should think about too? So I just wanted to open that just to validate with everybody that this could be an issue. And it's going to be a recurring problem. Is there a recurring solution we could put in place? Is that part community? Is it part technical? What should it look like? And then I think we should get back to Dan and give him some feedback on what we're thinking. I know there's a discussion with Yamamoto, but with time zones, I think he's in Japan. I think it might, we haven't been able to talk yet. So this is the first item on the agenda. I'm just going to open it up to the floor for some discussion. Thoughts?
Do we know what, putting aside the extended cons, do we know what is the minimal version of Whammer that supports all those features?
I don't. That's a really good question, actually.
I know Whammer has supported many of those things since I think 2.2. So we're on 2.2.2, and I think 2.2.3 is coming out soon. Extended const is not supported, as Chris said. I know reference types were turned on recently, I think back in December, or part of the reference types were turned on the WASI SDK, and that had been supported for a while. So I'd have to go back and look, but I know at least the last like 6 months it's been supported, most of these.
Okay. Yeah, we probably need to do the analysis on our side because we have older versions of the runtime running in production. So we just need to understand the impact of that.
I think the easiest way to figure it out is to go look at your source tree, and there's a bunch of like build Whammer XYZ options. And if they exist in your source, then it's very likely that support is there. If they don't exist in your support, then they probably are not there.
Yeah. Having said that, we do consider building WASI-libc internally, so might not be such a big of an issue. We just disable some of the parameters.
Yeah, it's certainly something that we've been thinking about in Siemens as well. If it's worthwhile, just in-housing part of the WASI-libc. But I think for a community group, if we're both doing the same thing to achieve the same goals for roughly the same settings, if there's a way to share that work, it would make sense, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so that's something that I'll definitely consider as thing to keep in mind. What is the latest version of Whammer that supports that build? And not only Whammer, perhaps other runtimes should be included as well.
Yeah, it's my failing here. I mean, I haven't had the chance to talk to Dan directly about this, but should do. I don't know if Dan and there's a dedicated WASI SDK call or a set of meetings, because you would have thought it would, this is obviously going to impact other runtimes as well to various extents, but just keeping everybody informed of what's going on there. I don't know if there's a meeting we should be in that I'm not in, so there's another to-do item there, just to reach out to Dan and talk to him about it and see how we can improve that communication ourselves.
One question I have around this Lime 1 thing, I understand why we're packaging some of these together, because it gets really awkward to talk about multiple things together and say, hey, you need this, 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 and this from the optional standpoint. But as far as I understand, most of these options are either optional in WebAssembly 1.0 or proposed for WebAssembly 2.0 and just not gotten to WebAssembly 2.0. Are we making our lives more complicated by having this interim step target? Right? Should this all just be WebAssembly 2.0, and then we think about WASI 1.0 with the component model and all that? Should that be all bundled together in one thing, rather than have this interim step that potentially? I understand why some of these things are wanted sooner rather than later, even on the WASI 1.0 P1 stuff. But should this really just be like WASM 2.0, right, versus Lime 1 as an interim?
I don't know. I think for me, when I think about it, this is going to be a recurring problem. There's always new proposals and core proposals that will impact how the libc would be compiled. And even compiler options, like we saw this with reference types. Or, and interestingly, that's been another recurring problem that's popped up internally this last couple of weeks here too. So there's always going to be a progression. I guess the question is, how do we handle it? And what's the best way to do it? Is it?
Well, I think before, not to interrupt, but I think before anything that was optional would be hidden behind it. Would not be turned on by default, like in the tool chain, right? If there's an if feature foo is optional in release X, then the tool chain should probably not enable feature foo by default. It could be hidden behind an options flag, right? That's how I've seen it done before. I'm not saying that's always the right choice.
No, and I think a lot of what we're trying to do is make it, well, at least from my perspective, the question, and I'm only thinking about WAMR, of course, but the question really for WAMR and for the toolchain is getting the match between the two. Whatever the toolchain produces, my version of WAMR can consume, and we all have slightly different versions of WAMR. But and if this is happening to WAMR and it's happening to other runtimes, would a better solution be something like the runtime can produce a configuration file? Use this, build your WASI SDK with this, and it works with WAMR 1.2. WAMR 2.2 has a different one. And you could just supply like a configuration file for the WASI SDK. And that way provides a way of keeping the two in lockstep. So whatever this tool produces, this runtime can consume. And it's something like that. I'm thinking technically, but also practically a way of synchronizing the two. So rather than thinking about Lime, just think about configuration and maybe other runtimes, WAS0 or WASM Edge or WASM Time could have their own. And that way nobody's held back and everybody has the ability to have a WASI SDK that works for their particular configuration.
Are you suggesting that the distribution of WASI SDK should be pushed to the runtime maintainers?
No, I'm like the configuration options for it could be provided by the runtime maintainer. My runtime.
So yeah. So like in addition to your binary that gets outputted as a build, you get a file that says here's the options that were enabled, right? You get some sort of manifest file that says here's the features that I compiled, assuming were enabled. I think is what Chris is saying.
Yeah. We kind of do that. I mean, in fairness, I think I don't know who did the work. We had a discussion about given the WAMR output. There's a discussion on the WAMR forum about formatting it to let people know what features are turned on and off, and that work is amazing. It's been really useful. Actually, references are turned off. I can see that. It would essentially be something like that you would then have the ability to have the WASI SDK build itself to that configuration. So now you know whatever the WASI SDK produces is going to work with your runtime. Maybe that's a suggestion we could make with Dan and see if we could add that in, because I imagine it would be a bunch of pre-compile flags that you're supplying to the WASI SDK. And just set up the build.
I think the problem I have with that is sort of the same problem I would have with doing this in any other instruction set architecture. Is I'm given a binary, right? And for me to run that binary, obviously there's some dependencies I have, but the header that we have in WASM right now sort of indicates what you're targeting, right? What version and that fun stuff. And what you're proposing basically says, hey, there's that plus some other information that because there's all these optional things that we potentially could turn on or off.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sort of takes away the universal runtime now. It's like I have a universal runtime and this combinatorial problem of how many options I can enable or disable, right? And I have to get those right on both sides, or at least close for that to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of takes away some of the universality of it. some of this isn't, inevitable, right? We're going to have some of these issues as the standard progresses. But I think if we aren't careful, the explosion of potential options could get really, really, really nutty fast.
Yes. I mean, one side says it's no longer portable code, is it?
Right.
Right. The other side says, it's a solution to obsolescence and to long-term code maintenance. So if we're building systems with WAMA runtimes that are difficult to update, that need to be in production for years at a time, might provide a convenient way to have that build configuration and the runtime configuration match met. So I see both sides of it. Like I don't think there's an easy solution to it, but
Yeah. I think one thing we could do is I think this is where also like we're gonna have this problem in LTS in general, right? When we talk about having a version of the SDK that can be used on the P1 runtimes for a period of time, right? There has to be a fair amount of stability around that in general, right? So we're gonna have issues where, well, not issues, but we're gonna have to tackle the problem where, hey, there's a version of the SDK that I can use that is quote unquote current and stable, and that works with a set of runtimes, right? And those are not going to move forward to the latest and greatest changes per se, right? Because they're LTS, right? And so maybe that's how we crack this one. Maybe we actually have to have a different LTS release of the SDK versus the P2 component model, P3 version of the SDK. Not saying they have to be built from different source, but at least two different builds, right? And then you just choose the tool chain you want. Maybe that's the path that we're gonna need. And then what we can do is just say, okay, for LTS, here's the options that are supported by those runtimes, and we'll just have to deal with that. And that might require some gyrations around potentially what version of LLVM and the compiler tool chain, or how we compile the LLVM compiler tool chain, et cetera, et cetera. So that may have some downstream effects that I haven't thought through fully yet. So.
Yeah, I can see that that needing to
There's
happen.
a lot of background noise from somebody. If folks who are not talking can mute.
I have the
Thank you.
power. I have the power to mute. So,
Perfect.
that's okay. Yeah, so I think, yeah, I mean, we're going to have to do it anyway for LTS, but if we implemented it using this trick, then we have something that, hey, even internally, if you're building your own libc for a legacy solution, you can still have a configuration auto-generated from the runtime that says build your libc with this in, and it would work. So I don't know. There's no easy solution to this, but it is something that's going to keep coming up and biting us. I'm thinking that having the latest WASI SDK is important for security and bug fixes and so on. So would like to make sure that you're using the latest, even if not all the features can be enabled, right? So then the question is, how do we as a community make sure that that's available and easy to digest, and we solve the problem we've seen before of, oh, there's an update and it's producing something that my runtime does not support. I mean, if you really wanted to go super far to it, you could add a custom section into the top of a WASI binary with a bit of metadata that says, hey, what are these things are enabled in this? And you could at least have something that you could inspect, I suppose. So arguably you'd want to strip it out for embedded systems, but at least you'd have something that comes out of the WASM file that you could inspect. But yeah, so I think I'm thinking about actions, things we should do and follow up with. I think we should definitely get back to Dan, let him know that it's going to cause some issues. I think Yamamoto's done it, but we should have that. We should also see if there's a better way to share information and give feedback to Dan, and than what I've seen online, or I'm obviously missing something. So go and see if we can get more involved in that feedback loop. Then I imagine adding the WASI SDK configuration file is an option. Certainly the LTS is something we're going to need to do, and I think we're going to have to in-house a version or at least a build of the WASI SDK for the LTS. So we should talk to Dan about that as well and what makes sense to do with that. So those are some action items. Set up a call with Dan and to go through that and have a chat and see what we can do together. Anything else you guys can think of we should do on this one?
One other suggestion that I just thought of as we were talking through this now, if extended const is the only thing in Lime 1 that does not supported by existing runtimes, I can't speak for WAS0 or WASM-Edge or the other ones, but at least for WAMR, I think that's the only thing that's not supported. We could ask them to remove that from Lime 1.
Mm-hmm.
That's another option.
Yeah, I don't know the background of how that was decided. I haven't yet had the chance to read up on the GitHub discussions around that, so it'd be interesting to learn how that list was pulled together. And certainly, I think in terms of road mapping for runtimes, being involved in the discussion, like, hey, we've got an interim thing, it's going to be line 1, and these are the features that we really think should be on there. Well, then certainly, I think having the WAMR team involved, and if we're going to do an LTS, having the LTS team involved, like, oh, the future version is going to need these things. Okay, at least we know, and then we can try to keep in step with that roadmap as well. So that would be good. That's a good suggestion.
I have a question on it. If I got it right with the Lime approach, it's not only about the question about libc.a, so about the WASI libc, but also about what the compiler toolchain is emitting at the end of the day. As I can see that extended const as a supportive option is done in LLVM, which would then mean then what we are talking about and enabling it is that Clang itself, no matter which kind of target you're using, if it's enabled by default, then it would mean that any generated code by Clang is not going to work with WAMR. So that is,
I think it's both. I think it is what is the defaults that the compiler is going to have, and that compiler would be included in WASI SDK. And then also that same compiler is going to be used to compile libc. So you're right. It's not just in the library. It would also be the default in the compiler, from what I understand.
So what I try to, so I just want to better understand which kind of impact this proposal has in terms of WASI SDK, because for me WASI SDK consists of Clang and of WASI libc, kind of. And it's one thing to just say you need to use your own libc, which might be okay. But it's another thing if the compiler just emits code no matter what, and it's not able to be executed in WAMR. This is what I want to make clear in all those discussions. If the discussion says, no, Clang will emit code that WAMR cannot execute no matter what, then I think that's going to be a problem. If that's not the case, then I think there are mitigation strategies.
For the Clang specifically, isn't there always an option to disable this? So we have kind of like a fine-grained control. That's at least my assumption, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, you can
You
set something
should.
like minus M CPU. I think you have something like minus M CPU. You could set up some things for CPU, and I guess you could also set up something for Lime, but maybe I'm wrong. But that
No,
needs to
I think
be
it's-
figured out, kind of.
I think it must be talking
I
about
think
what
that's the.
options are enabled by
Oh,
default.
go ahead, wait, Luke.
Oh, that's my assumption as well. I think mostly we're talking about what options are enabled or disabled by default.
Right, and I think the problem with being so Marcin, I think you're right. You could disable like extended const, for example. But I think you get to this weird situation where you have to like, if this becomes the default and you want to turn extended const off, for example, you get to set a bunch of flags everywhere you compile, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that can get pretty cumbersome to do, right? If you've ever looked at the options Clang has, it's crazy. With great power comes great complexity.
No, that's for sure. I'm saying is that it's not impossible. It's not the same situation as we have with libc.a, that it's been already compiled with those flags, and you either take it or not. There's nothing you can do about this.
True.
Yeah. Okay. But it does raise another point of we're at the bottom end of quite a long chain, a value chain. We've got the Clang team as well, and LVM, and contributions coming from a lot of different parties, including Google and the Inscripted team, and they upstream things and then they come down as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on there, and I think it probably makes sense to do a little stakeholder map and make sure we know where we sit and the folks we need to talk to, and make sure that we can keep that conversation alive and open up those paths of conversation so that we don't end up in a situation where it's like, oh, I saw a conversation here by two people, Yamamoto and Dan, and then Dan and the Wasentime team about this. Oh, and we can get to a more fluid information exchange at the very least. It's one thing. And the other thing is to think about, oh, okay, if we're going to have a situation where we have multiple runtimes for the embedded community and each one's tweaked slightly differently, do we want to have a configuration file, some data configuration file that allows us to match the libc compiler flags and the runtime together? Is that something that makes sense as well? So that was one. Okay, I think we've got some action items there. Hopefully Stephen's managed to scribble them down for me. If not, I'll be going back through the call.
I'm trying to get the notes clear. It's not so easy.
Much appreciated. I know how difficult it is. Okay. Any more discussion on that one? Or we move on to our next item? 3, 2, 1. Right, LTS. We touched on it in the last agenda item. We need to start thinking about the LTS a bit more structured. We've got some, we identified the need for it. There was a spattering of ideas about what the LTS should do. There was discussions around we should get a memorandum of understanding and stuff like that, which are all good. But we also need to really define exactly what we mean when we talk about an LTS. And that overlapped with the last topic of like, hey, there's this line 1, there's changes coming to the WASI SDK. So when you look at what more established communities would do, so you look at what, say, Red Hat or Wind River do in terms of setting up LTS like projects, the major investment in part is technology, but is also really around community structure and best practice. So that's about making sure there's processes and controls in place and not one-off decision making. It provides consistency to the community, but really importantly, it means that there's no one individual who is central to having to be there. There's no, I guess, how many members of the LTS team would need to be hit by a bus for the project to fail, and it should be zero. Because everything's well documented and understood, and somebody else can step in and run it. So that's really what we want to do. If it's truly long-term support, it's going to be an effort that has a longevity that might exceed any one of our own individual abilities to contribute to it. So in that case, what we should be doing is setting up for long-term success. And long-term success means processes and controls and things like that. And the first thing to do is just to outline exactly what it is we would need and what controls and processes we should put in place. We're not starting completely from a blank slate because we have a wealth of other open source projects that have done this before us and have learned, and we can learn from others. But things we need to do really is start to brainstorm some of the things we want to make sure are in place for the kickoff of an LTS. You know, a full definition at the end of an LTS release cycle, what do we have, and start to sketch that out. I know Stephen has started some of this already, but then there are other things that we're going to need. So if we want a well-tested, well-verified solution, we need a CI/CD process and pipelines and resources to support it. And that means I know somebody who's paying for GitHub Actions or virtual machine support. Martin, I saw a great proposal by you on could we use QEMU and emulation for doing some WAMA target specific testing, and could those be hooked into the WASI, into the GitHub Actions for the CI/CD pipeline for WAMA? And that's a really good idea. So things like that come up. Multi-architecture testing and validation, so it would be a big thing, and how we could do that and what that would look like. And then I also put in, validating that the WASI SDK output works for a common set of WAMA configurations. So that would also be a really important thing to do, since we don't control the WASI SDK, at least consuming it and building a set of test applications and making sure they all work as expected on WAMA with the configurations that we have. Some of the WAMA configurations change depending on the target and platform. So there are subtle differences. So checking and validating that would be good. So this is my brainstorming as I went into this. I'm looking for other contributions. I know I've missed a whole bunch of stuff here, but just to get that down. Then the other thing that came up in a discussion with the Bytecode Alliance TSC actually was, the need to make sure that code contributions are permissible. There's no unattributed code thrown in, and we don't have people copying stuff off Stack Overflow and sticking it into the product and all the rest of that. So we need to define a contributor license agreements, and I know that can turn into an awful lot of legalese, but essentially what we should do is define, do we need a contributor license agreement? What does it want to do? Is it to avoid unattributed code? Is it to make sure that there's no that anybody who contributes to it, they're not claiming the copyright on it? Or is it to make sure everyone really contributes to it? It's not saying there's a patent on it that they own because they've just inserted it in there. All those sorts of things come up. So those are things I thought would be good to talk about today, and just try and get a brainstorm list of to-dos and actions and things we need to clarify for the LTS, and then go about making sure that we do. And probably the best way to do that is to collect a list in this call, if we can get some more suggestions to it, and then start creating GitHub issues, sticking in each one of these items, giving a definition for what it should be, and essentially just driving it through to a conclusion between us all. so that we have something pretty solid. And if there's gaps, leaning on our colleagues in other open source projects who have gone through this process before or are operating in a project which has all of this set up already and looking for what works and what we can borrow and what we can learn from. So, folks, is there something else I'm missing here? I know we need contributor license agreements. We're going to need coding standards. I think we can inherit a lot of that from what the WAMA team has. So what other things do we need to bring in here to think about? And I'm not suggesting we need to give a definition of what these should exactly be. I mean, I'm not asking for a definition of coding standards, but just the fact that, hey, coding standards would be really good. Let's make sure we cover it. Let's get the big ticket items in here and list them all out. Is there anything else you guys can think of that we should throw in? The floor's open, just looking for suggestions.
I have a couple of questions and then one suggestion. So for
Good.
things like the code submissions and even coding standards, isn't that a problem we have outside of LTS in general? Isn't that just a general problem? Because these are all bytecode. We're not talking about potentially any new projects. These are all bytecode alliance projects. Maybe these things don't exist and they're problems that we have to solve because they need to be solved as well for LTS. But are they? I don't think they're LTS specific. I guess is my question, my point.
No, I don't think they're LTS specific, but they're an important point. I mean, let me learn how to speak English again. There are an important bit of setting up a project for long-term success, right? You need those things.
Absolutely.
So that's why I'm going through it. Like, let's just list them all out. Now,
Okay.
the BCA also has a whole process around getting what's it? I forget the terminology, but it's where projects hit a quality bar that the TSC set, and it says selected project or something. I forget the exact phrasing, but there is an internal quality bar also in the BCA. So what I'm proposing is let's just go through a list of everything we need to do. Boom, here you go. What can we borrow from existing projects? What's missing? Do the gap analysis and fit it all in and fly through this.
Okay. The other thing I was going to add, and there's a bunch of other hands up, so I'll go quick, is a CVE tracking security process.
Yes. And I see loads of hands up, so I apologize. It's hard to see hands come up when you're sharing your screen, so I missed some of it. I see the first one up I see here is Rob and then Marcin, I think, in that order. I apologize if it wasn't.
Hi, everyone. I was just wondering, was there a reason why a license agreement was needed instead of the standard developer certificate of origin?
No, not really. The concern that was raised at the LTS was validating code contributions to the project from other members and other members from other contributors, and really understanding the value of that and making sure that the code was not unattributed and copied from somewhere else when that was it. But if we can address that with a lighter weight mechanism, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I think the DCO might be the way to go, as long as everyone in the Bytecode Alliance agrees.
That's a good idea. Thanks, Rob. Totally. Let's see if we can
And
do it.
has there been any discussion as to how long you'd want the support to last?
Yes, I'm going to turn this one over to Stephen.
Well, so one thing with the DCO is the nice thing too is within GitHub, there's a bunch of bots that you can put on that automatically check the DCO. So you can just turn that on and know that all the pull requests and contributions include the DCO. So that's a nice mechanism because there's an automatable and enforceable tool for that. With regard to support period, a bunch of things have been proposed. It's not uncommon in industry to have a 10-year support cycle. So that's kind of what we were toying around with at first. The question would be 10 years from when? So I proposed, I'm putting together a document with Chris. I proposed sort of a timeline there where, there might be a few additions and some changes that we need to do. Things like the options, like we just talked about, we need to sort out. And that might be a period of like 6 to 12, maybe 18 months. And then after that, it's only really bug fixes and security. And then after some longer period of time, and toolchain updates. So like a new compiler, new libc, that kind of stuff. And then after a period of time, it's bug fixes and priority bug fixes and then security updates only. And then maybe towards the very end, it's critical security updates only. So there's a typical pattern these things follow. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. And so we put a period of time on all that. Initially, we were thinking somewhere 5 to 10 years. That may not be long enough for some, maybe way too long for others. So I'm sure we'll have to debate that. But any thoughts and inputs would be super welcome, though.
Would there be any limitations on the scope of the target? Like, for example, the platform or the architecture that would be supported?
I think we would need to. I think that would make sense. Right, we can't say, hey, and any and all embedded our tosses out there, right? There's an infinite number of them, and operating systems do pop up over time and go away over time. So I think we'd probably want to outline maybe like tier 1 and tier 2, and say, hey, we're gonna provide all this for tier 1. Tier 2 is maybe best effort, and then tier 3, you really can't expect to be, or everything else you can't expect to be supported, right? So I think that would make sense. Something like that would make sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. Cool.
Good discussion. Thanks, Rob, Stephen. And Martin, you had your hand up.
No, not anymore.
That's good. Okay, so I think what I'll do is I think I'm going to turn just the brainstorming session into a Google document. I'll send it out on the Zulip chat. I'll also send it out and include the link in the meeting notes for this. With the brainstorm list, I'll have it updated what we've just talked about today, put it up in a Google document, and we can try and throw in any ideas or concerns or questions we have into it to keep us going, and then start turning those into tasks to drive for solutions. And that'd probably be the best way to get some of the fundamental scaffolding of the LTS up in a relatively short period of time, hopefully. But yeah, there's a lot to do, and there's no these are suggestions, and the feedback and the improving suggestions are very much appreciated. So if there's something you don't agree with, or there's a better way of doing it, all contributions are very gratefully appreciated. There's don't feel shy about questioning something or throwing in an idea. I'm positively encouraged. Those were the 2 major items. Has anybody got any other suggestions for this topic while we have another 10 minutes remaining?
One other thing that I was going to say, in terms of making this list complete, you talked about CI/CD builds, testing, validation. Rob had asked about platforms, OSs, architectures. I think also for LTS, we want to probably be very specific as to what runtimes we're talking about as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of us here tend to assume Wemmer is the runtime of choice. So I think Wemmer's on the list, most definitely. But there might be other runtimes that we need to include, or other runtime-like things that we need to include. Whether that's WASM to C, WAS0, et cetera, et cetera. So think the list of runtimes that are supported needs to be here.
Yep. Yep. Timeline, list of runtimes, configuration, matching for the WASI SDK, CI/CD pipelines, multi-architecture testing, ISAs that are supported as well. Let's put those in. Better suggestions for the contributor license agreement, also good. Put those in. Then coding guidelines, coding standards, also good. Community best practice and behavior guidelines. We can borrow those, I think, from the BCA, but we should at least make sure that we address that. And principles on addressing problems. So whether there's a clash of conflict, what are the key things that make sense to prioritize? So is it alignment with the WASI SDK? Is it preserving existing WAMR or runtime support? Which ones take precedent in which situation? So a set of, I guess, guiding thoughts and principles would also be good for that sort of conflict resolution when those questions and discussions come up. As something that will help us guide us through those discussions would be important too. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. There's a lot there, but let's stick it all into-
Documentation.
Oh yeah, big one. Documentation. Oh,
One other thing that I would say too is that'd be really helpful is what is the strategy around debugging? I was working with Ralph because he had a great presentation at WASM.io about debugging.
mhm.
And on Linux, it just works with WASM time. I could do source level debugging of both the runtime itself, WASM time, as well as directly line by line in WASM source code. It's fantastic. That is not as achievable on WAMR. There's a fork of LLDB, and there's some things you can do to get it working, but it's a fork of LLDB. It's an old fork of LLDB from what I can tell, and it requires a fair amount of setup. And so I think anything we can do to make debugging work the same across all these platforms and all these runtimes, I think is just righteous for WASI in general. Whether or not that's achievable, I don't know. But I think also just making it simpler to debug and having a good debugging solution. Because as I think Ralph's presentation was, no more printfs, because that's how most of us had been debugging before then. So I think debugging is something that we need to take a long, hard look at. And I think that dovetails into what's going on in the latest versions of WASI as well. WASM time seems to have really good support for that, at least on Linux. And so that's awesome. I'd like to see that level of support elsewhere as well.
Yeah, very good. The other thing, I guess, particularly for cyber physical systems, is not just debugging but observability. So, and that folds into the stuff you can see Elizabeth doing at Carnegie Mellon. They have a project where you can instrument the runtime, so you can dynamically script their wizard runtime and track for, I want to intercept loads and stores, and I want to understand what's going on with these function calls. And
Yeah, there are also differences in what you are debugging. Do you debug the interpreted code, or do you debug the AOT code? And if it's about monitoring, what kind of impact does it have when you look at latencies and jitters? What needs to be done there? This is also not yet solved, as far as I got it.
yeah, and that would dovetail in with developer best practice for developing WebAssembly embedded applications, right? You could mock up and do logical debugging on the Linux machine, but for on target debugging, it might be more appropriate to have observability rather than traditional on target debugging. if you're controlling a piece of machinery, for instance, you can't stop that. You need to keep doing that, but understand what the software is doing in a lot more detail. So that might be an interesting angle, but that's something to put on the list. Debugging, good call, Stephen. We could probably have another WASI, SIG-Embedded WASI discussion purely on what the debugging strategy should be, what it should look like. Probably be a really good discussion too. Okay. Any more for any more? Awesome. Silence means give me my 4 minutes back.
Yep. There's no hands up, so I think we're good.
Okay, great. In that case, thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the contributions so far. Got some action items I've got to do. As I'm pretty sure Stephen's captured. And hopefully I'll see you on a Google Doc sometime in the near future. And then if you'd like to, I'm going to reach out to Dan. I know, Stephen, you were talking about reaching out to Dan as well to try and foster better communication here. If there's anybody else that wants to be involved in those discussions, you're more than welcome, of course. It's not just closed, but we'll try and set that up. Maybe we'll see if Dan would like to come along and join us for one of our future eSIG discussions. That would be good too. So let's crack on. I'll see you in some GitHub issues and some meeting notes and a Google Doc in the near future, and hopefully in a not too long delayed YouTube video upload. Thank you very much, folks.
Thanks all. Cheers. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.